can you tell us, Hayley, what soldering is and just briefly describe the process? Because sometimes it's a bit different to like using a soldering iron and some of the
Yeah.
things that sometimes people may have heard of before coming to jewelry making.
Yeah, so soldering is actually the wrong terminology, but it's the widely used terminology in the industry. It's actually brazing is what we do. So soldering is using a soldering iron, and it's for lead soldering or the type of soldering that you would do on circuit boards or stained glass windows with lead. But we've adopted the term, and it's globally used. And so the type of soldering we do is very different to that other circuit board and lead soldering. What we do is we use a torch, various different types of torches that reach quite high temperatures, so near on 1,000 degrees or over that, whereas that other type of soldering iron only gets to about 70 to 100 degrees. So there is quite a substantial difference in the heat. Soldering that we do basically becomes when you solder two pieces together or a join, you add in a solder extra component or extra element that fuses and it melts and it becomes a solid. The other type, it actually just sits on the surface, so it's not a solid join. And those are the key differences between those types of soldering.
Amazing. So we've got our metal, we've got our solder, which is different from our metal, and we're using the solder to join the piece together. And this is used so much in jewelry making, isn't it? Like every ring, every jump ring, like it's such a fundamental kind of skill, I think. And it's one of those things, like for me anyway, to begin with, I was a bit scared of because, I'd get frustrated, I'd get it wrong, and it's fire and all these kind of things I wasn't used to. But once you get used to it, it's very addictive, I think, because you're suddenly like, wow, there's all these amazing things I can do and put together and designs I can come up with. So I always love seeing people learn and go on their soldering journey because it just expands what's possible design wise when you feel confident with like multiple solder joins and all those kind of things. So tell us a bit about solder. What are the different types of solder, and how would we choose the solder? Let's start there.
Okay, so solder is an absolutely essential ingredient in the process of soldering. Um, in some forms of metalsmithing, you might fuse the metal together, which is you heat it up and it bonds to itself because of the heat. We need an extra element called solder. So we add in another bit of metal. It is silver, but it's mixed in with other metals. Chromium, I think, is cadmium is the ingredient in that. And at different degrees of the amount. So what that does, it actually melts at a lower temperature than the actual melting point of silver, which means that it will melt and flow into the join that you're making, but it's actually not going to then cause the general silver area to melt. However, that can happen when you're not used to it, or when you've got a tricky project, and that's the area that makes us really scared. Solder itself comes in different strengths. Easy, medium, and hard are the most commonly used ones. You do get extra easy and you do get extra hard, but I've never used them in my entire career. So they basically melt at different temperatures. So you would usually start with hard. It melts at the highest temperature, which is around about 780 degrees. And that's basically your go-to solder. The reason why we have other solders is because if you've got a complicated join and you don't want the first or the second join to melt, you then go to the medium solder, because that will melt at a lower temperature than the hard solder, which is around 730 degrees C. And then the easy solder is around 680 degrees. That varies slightly depending on the solder that you buy, but it's an approximate. So let's say, for example, you're doing a slightly complicated ring. You've got a claw setting on top of it. The ring you'll solder, the join with a hard. And you try and use the hard for as long as possible. But the very final stage is when you're just putting the finishing soldering bits to the claw setting. You might use easy solder because you don't want the other joins to run, otherwise the whole thing will fall apart. So that's basically why it's different to solder, different types of solder.
We've all been there.
Yeah, we have.
The seventh solder joint and everything apart, and you're like, no. Okay, great. I will get onto the questions in just a moment. I just want to cover the basics just for anyone new. So tell us a bit about Flux. What is Flux and why is it important in our soldering?
Right, so Flux is the most important thing in soldering. I have a little sort of checklist when it comes to soldering. And so you've got a good join. So make sure that your join that you're soldering together is neat and clean. You need your solder. So we just talked about the solder. You'll choose the right solder for the job. And then flux. Flux is an absolutely essential element in the process. And it's a thing that is the most forgotten because there's so much to do. So flux is, it could be liquid flux, it could be borax, which is made into a paste, it could be a gel. There's different forms of flux. We most commonly use either borax or liquid flux, which is a bright yellow liquid. You paint that onto the join area, and then you put your solder on that join area once the flux is there. What it does is it kind of cleans the surface. It gets rid of any dirt and impurities, and it also slightly guides the solder where to go, but it's mainly about cleaning the area. What you'll find is if you forget your flux, the solder will not flow. So if you do your little checklist in your mind, good join, I've got my solder, did I put the flux on? And you think, oh no, I didn't put, that's why the solder isn't flowing, or that's why it's nearly melted because you kept your temperature there for too long and you forgot to put your flux on. So that's very important. Do your little checklist, make sure you've got your flux.
Absolutely. And good join is such a big one, isn't it? Like I remember when I first started, I was like, I'm sure it will fill the gap. It's roughly touching each other. It'll be fine. And then it just wasn't happening. And I was like, why is it not happening? But I think as you train as a jeweler and as you make more, you get used to being a bit more specific with things. At first, you're like, well, they're kind of near each other. That should do. And we get used to training our eyes and our hands and our brains to like, no, it really needs to touch as slightly as possible. And makes the cleanup a lot easier as well.
It does. Yeah.
Great. So I feel like we covered the basics. We can always come back to them if people have questions, but let's have a look in the chat. Sharon is here. She says, hello from Oregon, USA. Lovely to see you, Sharon. Lovely to see all of you guys who are saying hi in the chat. Angela says, I'm having problems soldering a post onto an earring. I use fine silver metal clay. It seems to have soldered, but the post comes off. Any thoughts on this, Hayley? Why might the post be coming off? I guess we can talk about it generally like for any piece, but also maybe we can talk about fine silver metal clay. And if you need a hand with that, I'm here.
Yes. To be honest, there's a couple of things that could be going wrong there. The first thing that springs to mind is you're not keeping your flame there for long enough. It's fear. We do it because we don't want to melt the little pin. But if you're worried about melting the pin, remember that the actual little charm, the fine silver charm that you're heating up is actually your bigger amount of metal. So focus the heat on that, and then you can on occasion flick it onto the pin. But to be honest, you probably don't need to do that too much because it's probably a small little item and it's getting that heat anyway. So the important thing for the solder to flow is that the two parts that are coming together reach the same temperature at the same time, and then the solder will flow. So if one part is too hot and the other isn't, it's not going to flow evenly. So you always look at where is your dominant amount of metal, i.e. the charm or the base or a ring, and spend more time heating that up, and then on occasion go on to the lighter area. So that is the thing that springs to mind for me. But I do know that metal clay, I don't work with metal clay at all, so Jess can perhaps help.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
porous, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So silver metal clay is very similar to soldering sterling silver or any other kind of silver, but like Hayley said, it is more porous. So it's recommended that you put roughly 4 times the amount of solder on, because the fine silver really absorbs the solder. So what could be happening, and it's always like a investigation, isn't it, with soldering, like what is happening, and you're never quite sure until you sort of try out different things and experiment. But it could be that there's just not enough solder, so it's like sort of flowing and touching, but then it's just being sucked sucked into the silver metal clay. So it's recommended, instead of just putting a giant chunk on that's 4 times bigger, is to do 4 little pieces around, you know, where you're going to go, so that it can help it flow, and when it absorbs you've still got plenty left. But yeah, silver earring posts are quite challenging, aren't they? They're quite a good one to just sit down and do like a bunch of, and just practice and kind of get.
The other thing, sorry to interrupt, Jess, is that you're probably holding it in place with a tweezer, a steel tweezer. And that is also it's more metal in the system. And steel will take up a lot of heat. So if your tweezer that's your post and that's the little base, if your tweezer's down there, that steel is actually going to be in the way of where the heat needs to go. So hold the tweezer higher up so that it's not in the way of the area that needs to be soldered. But yes, batch making them is probably a very good idea, because then once you get into the swing of it, you just get into a rhythm and it works really well. So yeah,
absolutely, because you want to feel confident once you've soldered something that it's definitely in place. I think something, I don't know if you do this as well, Hayley, but sometimes it's quite a good idea once you've done soldered on an earring post, is to give it a little twist with your tweezers, your pliers, sorry, just to work hard in the metal a bit, because it's been annealed. But also, if it doesn't come off when you twist it with pliers, you're probably safe. So it's good to test it.
Yes, that's a very good bit of advice, because once you've heated up any metal, it's going to be softer. So an earring pin, when you put in the back on it or put it through the piercing, it will bend out of shape. So as Jess said, you can use a pair of flat pliers and just give it a very gentle twist. And that's a good test to see if the joint is working well, but it also hardens up the work. Another thing you can do is actually use a burnisher, whether it's a metal one or an agate one, and just rub up and down the post, and that also hardens it. But yes, that's a very good test to see if your solder has gotten, it has flowed as it should. So yeah.
It's always disappointing when it hasn't, but it's much better that we discover it in our studio than you know, when it's on someone's ear and it comes off. So you want to feel really confident in your solder joints for sure. But yeah, thank you for the question. It's a good one to start us off with. Someone has asked, Hayley, what's your favorite flux, and also how do you mix borax?
Okay, so I use both liquid flux and borax. I learned with borax, and if you speak to any really old school maker, they'll only use borax. But then I discovered liquid flux, and we're all a little bit lazy. So liquid flux requires no preparation whatsoever. You buy it, it's in its liquid form, you use it, and it's very quick and easy. Borax, however, often comes in a cone, but it can be a square, compacted item, or the powder itself. And you add a bit of water to that. And if it is in a cone, you've got a pestle and you use it like a pestle and mortar, you get a creamy substance, paste, and then you use that on the join. If it's a powder form, you just add a bit of water to the powder and do the same thing. To be honest, I use liquid flux for quick and easy jobs, but for more complicated jobs, for gold, for dual metal, I use borax. If I'm having a problem with soldering and things aren't going quite to plan, I revert back to borax, because it is definitely, I find it's the better one of the two. The other thing that's an advantage about borax is when you dry it out, it goes a little bit pasty and crusty. And what is quite useful about that is if you're working on a curve or something that's a bit tricky to put the solder in position, you can actually put it on the paste of the borax and it sits in that quite nicely. So it has several advantages.
Yes, because actually getting the solder to sit where you want it to sit, I feel like that's half the challenge with soldering, like the balancing method. And perhaps we could talk briefly about the different methods, because there's sort of pick soldering, there's balancing, there's using the brush. Like maybe talk through those different methods and what people might use them for.
So yeah, so I'll come back to pick soldering because it's a more advanced technique that. But you'll probably start off by either using a pair of tweezers, very fine tip tweezers, picking up your pallion of solder. So you've cut your solder into tiny little pieces. They're called pallions. And you'll place your solder either with your tweezers or a little wet brush. So the brush that you've used to put your borax on with, or your flux, wet that so you don't have any more of that on. And it's wet but not dripping. And then you can use that to pick up your piece of solder and place it. I actually find that that's more accurate for me, only because sometimes if you've got a slightly shaky hand, the tweezers can be a nightmare. If you're in a stressful situation and it's potentially got a lot to go wrong, if you're slightly nervous, getting your tweezers exactly where you want them to be is a bit tricky. I find the brush works well for me. The pick soldering is, if you learn with that to begin with, it's a fantastic technique. So what that means is you've got a probe or a little pin, a stick. It's usually a titanium stick. You have a piece of solder on your block. You melt the piece of solder, and your probe sits alongside it. So as you're heating those two up together, it melts into a little ball, and the probe picks it up, and then you take it over to the join, and then you heat the area up and it place that there. So it takes a lot more precision when you're working, and it comes with a bit of confidence. So it might be something you want to practice, but the easier way to begin with is to do it just with a tweezer and a brush.
Absolutely. And I think from what I've seen with the different jewelers and the different teachers, and when I'm doing soldering, like different ways work for different pieces. So for example, if you're soldering a ring, often the easiest way is to just put the solder at the bottom, and it just flows straight up, and it's on the ground. It can't go anywhere, hopefully. It's sorted. But as Hayley said, as you get more advanced with your jewelry making, and perhaps you're soldering like multiple claws onto one piece and you can't even get the thing on and hold it in place, that's when something like pick soldering might be really helpful, because you can literally really delicately place it on. I think lots of patience, isn't it? Lots of deep breath.
Yeah, deep breaths and you mentioned about the solder blowing away. And this is something that will frustrate you all quite a lot. So basically, when you've put your flux on and then you put your solder in place, it's very easy once you get the torch on to heat it all up. Your solder might blow out of position, and that can be infuriating when you've spent 20 minutes trying to get it exactly where you need it to be. So the trick there really is to dry the flux out first. If there's any moisture that's left there, it's that, as it's drying and bubbling, that's moving the solder out of place. So get your flux on, take your torch, and just use the very tip, lick the area where you put the flux, or just turn the torch down a little bit so it's a softer flame, and dry out the area. So you'll start to see a little bit of a powdery crust of flux, and then you're not heating it up. Put the torch down, then you can place your solder, and that generally helps to prevent the solder flying in different directions. However, there's a lot to do, and you might forget. So if you do put your flux on, then you put your solder on, you think, oh no, I haven't dried out my flux. Do exactly what I said before with a softer flame, and just gently dry out the flux first so that it doesn't blow, and then turn up your flame, and then you can get your heat going.
Go all in for the soldering.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, we have lots of questions, which is great. So Stephanie says, I'm using a small handheld kitchen torch for soldering. I can manage to solder small pieces, but I can't seem to get the solder to flow for anything larger than that, no matter what I do. My guess is I need a larger torch. Are there any other ways to confirm that the size of the flame is the issue?
Well, you've answered your own question there, to be honest. It's correct. There is a limit to how much those amazing little hand torches will do. I've been doing platinum and gold and what have you, and I've got a big fancy torch, and I still use a little hand torch all the time. However, you're right. Big chunky rings, bangles, anything with more metal, add in some copper, and you're going to need a bigger torch. It's just the way it is. So what you could do is become a bit John Wayne and get two of those little torches, and then use two of them at once. It just means you've got to manage two hands. Or you can step up and get a plumber's torch and see if you can find one with a finer nozzle on it. But yes, more heat is the answer.
It's always good to have, I think, if you're progressing your jewelry making journey, to have a big torch as well as a little torch. Because like Hayley said, they're just certain designs. If it's really chunky or if it's a bangle, it's going to frustrate you no end to just be there with the torch for ages, just like, come on, heat up. And maybe we can have a little chat about torch options as well, because I think it's always a nice thing to think about progressing to. But also, if you find something that I've found is if it's just a tiny bit of extra heat you need, and something that really helped me in my early days in my journey is using the grids, the metal grids. I don't know if you can talk about that, Hayley, and like the heat conduction around the piece, because sometimes that can help too.
Yeah, there are various things you can try, and that's a very good suggestion. So you get a little piece of mesh that you can solder on, and what you can then do is direct the flame underneath from the underside. So that's what the mesh does. It bends down like that, or some of you might have a tripod. I find that the tripods actually take some of the heat that's needed, but you might have a different metal type to the one I've got. But yes, the little mesh allows you to get heat from the underside, and that means that the heat's getting everywhere it needs to. A charcoal block is also very good. Charcoal conducts the heat more. And try and direct your flame underneath where possible, or you can prop things up, use a bit of binding wire, make a little nest, and then pop something up on top of that. And again, you can get the flame underneath there. A thing that might happen when you're working on a project and you don't have enough heat is you can cause something called fire stain. It is the bane of any silver worker's life. So fire stain is a little gray hue that appears on your silver. And it's the copper content in the sterling silver that's tarnishing from not enough heat. So ideally, when you're soldering, you want to get in with the biggest flame you can without melting, get the job done and get out. But if you're there for ages trying to get your work done, trying to solder, trying to get it to do what you want to do, and it's not doing it, that's when that copper inside starts to tarnish. And once you've pickled it and you've cleaned it up and it looks amazing, you'll go, oh my gosh, what's that gray stain on there? And it's fire stain. And it's because you didn't have a big enough flame. So when you're working, the other thing is make sure that your torch is full of gas, because even a smaller flame on the torch can do that. You might have a torch that does a perfectly good job, but if it's not giving you the biggest flame that you can get out of it, you're going to get fire stain.
You don't want fire stain. It's better to avoid it than to have to deal with it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's always like when you make a piece and you kind of know the soldering's not gone well, and you're like, this is taking too long, and you're like, now the polishing's going to be a nightmare because there's fire stain. And it's one of those things that I think as you improve your soldering, all of your jewelry making improves, because if the soldering doesn't go well for various reasons, there's just so much more cleanup, and it just all kind of takes more time and energy. So that's why I often find, especially with beginners, like when you keep making the same sort of pieces, you get to a place where you're really confident with them, because the whole process is easier because the solder went well. It's such a fundamental part of the piece. Brilliant. Maybe we can briefly talk about torches, if people are going to progress, or if or when you might progress up to a different torch. What are the kind of larger torches that you've used, Hayley, or in your teaching and things that you could...
Yeah, so I would say probably even today, even these days, I'd probably say 80% of the time, maybe 60 to 70% of the time, I use the little kitchen torch. So that's got butane gas in it, and that's all you need, and it's great. But as we discussed, you sometimes need more heat, or you might even need more precision, a more delicate flame. If it's just heat, a plumber's torch, I always have one to hand. Those are usually butane and propane mix, or just propane. So there's different versions, and they generally have a bigger nozzle. They're great for heating things up, for forming a big cuff. They're good for that. They're good for melting down large enough quantities of metal. So if you're going to recycle some silver You can use those, but they don't have the fine tip that you might want. So you might want something that's got a precision tip, and there's different versions of torches out there. The one I first started off with was called a Rothenberger. So that will come with a propane and an oxygen canister. Very expensive to replace, particularly the oxygen, but I only used it when I needed it for platinum or for some very precise flames with the gold soldering. So it was worth it for that, and it was really quite safe to have in the studio, or I was at home at that point. But the point there is you've got propane and oxygen in the system, and that brings more heat. So that's why most jewelers, professional jewelers, will have a torch that has an oxygen canister in it as well, and usually propane. But there are other things, like there's argon, there's all sorts of things out there. But I now have a Smith's Little torch. It's the same thing. It's oxygen and gas, so propane and oxygen. You can have an oxygen canister, or you can have a repurposed medical oxygen generator, so that it's quite expensive to get it set up. So it's not something I'd start off with straight away. And also what you might find is that if you're working from home, your insurance might be slightly twitchy about having that kind of gas at home. So don't worry, you don't have to go out and buy these big fancy torches yet. I worked without one for years and years and years, and only in the last 4 years did I actually get the Smith's Little torch. So yeah, those are the ones that I've worked with, but there's lots of things. There's now laser soldering. As I said, there's argon soldering, there's puck soldering. It's quite complicated. I don't even know what some of those things mean, to be honest. But there's
I feel like we could do a whole session on torches for sure. Yeah, I know at the jewelry school we used to use, and I can never say the name right, I think it's French, Serviette.
Yes,
I bought like 30 of them. I still can't say the name.
You're right.
Yeah.
But that's a good alternative to the plumber's torch. So what that does, it's you've got your normal gas canister, generally propane, and that's got an attachment on a tube. Yeah, it just makes it more flexible. It's like having a flexi shaft on your gas canister, basically, because the plumber's torch is quite rigid. You've got to hold the whole thing like that. It just makes it more manageable. Also, you can I think you can get different attachments for that.
Yes, you can have like a more gentle flame and a flame. So a lot of jewelry schools kind of work with that kind of thing. But Hayley's right, and the thing that most insurance companies don't like is oxygen. It's the oxygen tank, which is why an oxygen generator, if you are more advanced and you are looking to progress these things, an oxygen generator is far safer because there's no oxygen held in it. So oxygen is the highly flammable thing that they won't want you to have in anywhere. Got that from the fire brigade when they came around to the jewelry school. They were like, no oxygen here, please. You can have your propane, no stored oxygen. I was like, okay, we can do that. That's fine. We've got oxygen generators. But anyway, let's go back to some of the questions. Asta says, when is the best way to place solder chips when soldering? Do you heat the piece first and then place the solder so it sticks to it? In that case, what tool is best to pick up your solder chip with? I experience solder sticks onto my solder pick and it's hard to transfer. Yeah, so maybe we can talk about that and just generally like the heating process, the sticking, how we manage that whole situation.
Yeah, so what's happening there is you're kind of doing a combination of the pick soldering technique and just the first one where you're picking it up and placing it, and you've kind of somewhere in between, but you're not doing one or the other. So what you can do is either, you don't need to heat up the solder first, just take your tweezers, pick that little bit of solder, place it on the joint, and then put your flame on the whole piece and heat it up. Or if you want to do the pick soldering technique, what you have to do then is heat up your pick. So the solder piece is on your block. You're running that, you melt it into a little ball. You run the solder piece into a ball, and then you heat up your pick at the same time. And eventually the little ball will actually fuse to the pick. then you move over to the join area and you start to heat up that area, and you've got to actually quite kind of delicately pull the pick away whilst putting the ball in the position you need it to be in. So it's a bit tricky, and if your pieces aren't well connected or well balanced together, you could move things out of position, so that could be a frustration. But if you're comfortable with that, then that's really what you've got to do. You've got to wait for it to run into a ball first, then place it, and then actually just a little bit of heat, and it does tend to actually go into the place you want it to go. But I would try one or the other, but not try and combine the two.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think something that I always try and keep in mind is like solder wants to go to heat, doesn't it? So anything that's hot, whether it's my pick, my tweezers, my piece, the hottest piece it's going to want to be near. So
Yes.
if I don't want it to stick to something, I want that to be cold. And
Hang on. So basically, solder will run with where the hottest place is. So that's often where you think when your solder goes where you don't want it to go, that's because the flame has gone in that direction, and that's where the solder's flowing to. So watch where you direct your flame. If you've got your solder joined, but actually it's run over there, when you're holding your flame, are you holding it like that so that actually the tip of the flame is beyond where you need it to be? So watch where your flame is. Obviously, you keep it moving so you don't melt anything. But when it gets to that hotter temperature, you can see the color of the metal changing. Then start to direct the tip of the flame where you want it to flow.
Like learning to drive, isn't it? It takes time. There's so many things to think about.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah, so be very patient with yourself, especially if you know you're sort of in your first year of jewelry making, because you're meant to get this stuff wrong. You're meant to mess up. You're meant to like have things that don't work. So I know that we've got all different levels on here, so we're sort of catering to all different stages. But I think, and those of you that are more advanced, you're probably doing lots of solder joins, so you're still meant to mess it up. Like when we're new to it's all part of the learning process, isn't it? Making those mistakes and seeing what's gonna, how we can solve them. The problem solving is all part of the journey. Great questions, though. We have a few more. Someone says, what about wire solder? Have you used wire solder, Hayley? And
I actually don't use one. I don't think I've ever used it. Again, it's about precision. So it's a bit like when you do lead soldering, that's pretty much wire soldering. So as you're heating it up, you're pulling it and you're dragging it. It's not something I've done before, but I'm guessing you've got to have a steady hand when you're doing it. So it might work well on more solid things, like maybe you're making a box or something that's quite flat. But if you're doing something that's quite delicate and it's a bit balanced, probably wouldn't use wire soldering for that.
Yeah, because it's a wire shape, isn't it? So it's a bit more tricky. I've used wire solder once, but it was only because I was buying gold and it was cheaper to buy it in a tiny bit of wire than a whole sheet. It was like a very niche thing. But I just used it like normal solder and just cut it up and just put it on. But you're right, it's not as like because it's round, it's slightly harder to balance. But if you're going to pick solder, then it's literally going to be the same because you just make it into a ball and off you go.
You've reminded me. That's exactly what I did, because wire solder and gold is definitely cheaper than the flat stuff. So what you can do if you do buy it is just hammer it flat and then cut it up. It just makes it more easy to balance and manage. But yeah, good point.
Good questions. Also, sometimes different countries have different availability of different solder and different flux and things. So don't worry if you're listening and some of the things you think, oh, I can't get that. There's always an alternative. And the Facebook groups are a great place to ask about local sourcing if that's something, because it's different in different countries sometimes. Stephanie says, while trying to solder a bezel onto a plate, sometimes my plate warps when heated, making a huge gap between the two. Of course, I can't solder them when they're not touching. How can I stop the warping from happening? I don't know if you've had this, Hayley, or seen any.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I have. So there's a couple of things that could be happening there. Perhaps you're either heating it up too much and it's slightly melting, or it does sometimes separate. There is a bit of movement. What you can do is actually when you let it cool down and you can either or maybe on your steel block or what have you, take the plate and just press it down towards the bezel, not the other way around because you'll flatten the bezel. And sometimes just curving it ever so slightly so it comes closer to where you need it to be will actually bring it closer together. But really the important thing is before you get your bezel onto the plate, make sure, hold it up to the light or a light source and make sure that it is completely flush with the plate. So it's before you even start soldering, you need to have it completely flush. And to do that, you can file it. But actually the best way is to have it on a piece of a flat surface on a piece of sandpaper and do your figure of eight sanding, which means sanding it in a figure of eight so you don't put too much pressure on one side. And then make sure your plate is completely flat before you start as well. So hammer that flat on your steel block, put the two together, hold them up to a light source and see if there's any light coming through. Otherwise, keep on cleaning it up and getting it right. It's all in the preparation, and unfortunately, there's no shortcuts in jewelry making. Even in manufacturing, you've got to clean things up, and it's the preparation and the cleaning up afterwards, which are the areas that we all find most frustrating, but are the most important things. So, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's one of those things, once you find the solution forever, then you're like, I've got it. I've got how to do it. But we have to go through those challenges, don't we, to sort of see, oh, this isn't working. And I think also over the years, you just naturally get to know metal better and the flame, and things become more intuitive. Whereas at first, it's just like we were saying, there's so many different moving parts to think about. And yeah, making lots of different pieces as well is a really great way to kind of learn and experiment with your soldering. And there's lots of different types of soldering as well. Brilliant. Caroline says, hi, do you recommend any particular tweezers for handling solder?
Just your fine tipped tweezer that you get in a kit, or you can buy them separately. But yeah, the basics. I wouldn't go for anything fancy. I go for the cheap stainless steel ones that you get from most suppliers. The finer the better. They do bend out of shape a bit, but you can actually just press them flat again, or I push them down on my steel block and it kind of evens them out again. Sometimes they get a little bit covered in flux, and I just put some tweezers, pliers on there, and it breaks away any excess flux that's built up on there. But yeah, fine tip tweezers are the ones that I use all the time.
Awesome. Yeah, make sure they're metal. I think most tweezers are. Well, we have plastic tweezers for the pickle. We haven't talked about pickle yet, and we can come on to that in just a moment. Asta says, what solder do you use when soldering chain jump rings, and how do you avoid unsoldering the previous ones?
So you can use either hard or easy, but I would say always you go for hard first. Cut your pieces of solder, your pallions, into really small pieces. And to avoid soldering it to the previous link, the best thing to do is, if you've got a reverse action tweezer, so pinch onto the loop that you're soldering and have the solder joins of the previous links hanging down away from the solder area, and direct your flame up away towards the link that's being soldered and not down towards the other links. So it's directing the flame is as important as anything, so that, because if you come in from, let's say that's your link and that's the chain hanging down, if I come in here with my flame, that flame can then go down to everything that's hanging below it. But if I direct it that way, then that's not going to be affected.
Yeah, it's angles, isn't it?
Yeah, angles, and the steel tweezers are really good heat sinks. So if you pinch the other bits of chain with the steel tweezers, they will not solder, because that steel tweezer is absorbing or taking away the heat that is needed for that. So it can be used as a tool for that purpose as well.
That makes sense. So really, we just want to see the join being soldered and the flame going away from everything else and just heating that one individual space. So we're not worried about the rest. But good question. Yeah, thank you for that one. Rosie's here. Hi, Rosie. Rosie says, when soldering multiple joins, I use different hardnesses of solder and Tipp-Ex with the windows open. Well done, Rosie. Sometimes, despite this, the solder from the first join has partially or completely disappeared, so that the join becomes very thin or even comes apart. How can I ensure this doesn't happen? It's a great question.
Yes, I think again, this has got something to do with directing the flame or making sure that your flame is really sharp. So, is your torch giving you a nice, neat, sharp flame? If not, you might need to consider getting one that does. And also, if you're directing your flame into whatever it is that you're soldering, is it going towards other solder joins, or can you direct it in the opposite direction on the way out? So that might do it. So Tipp-Ex is a good way to cover up or to try and prevent solder joins from flowing. A rouge paste or a greasy paste is also a good one. It's actually better, but the only disadvantage of that is if you get it where you don't want it to go, it can be a problem. Thermolock, no, not Thermolock, Thermogel. Is it Thermogel?
It's, oh, what is it called? Technoflux.
Technoflux, thank you.
Yeah.
Technoflux is another.
All these catchy names.
Yeah, it's basically a creamy thing that you can put on to prevent an area of heating up. It's a bit tricky to apply neatly and precisely, but it is useful. I use it sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good point as well, like learning as you go through, and especially for those of you guys like further on in your journey and doing lots of stone settings and things like that, learning when to use which hardness of solder is so important, isn't it? Because I remember I just used to use hard for everything, and then I had a teacher who was like, you can't keep using hard with all those collets, like they're just gonna, the original ones are just gonna kind of get really weak. So I think it's like a journey as well, isn't it, to learn about the type of pieces that you're making and what you need to do. But like, you know, like Hayley shared, there's various different blockers that you can use to help prevent. Although it does seem that the direction of the torch is the most important thing to me, because I remember I used to think, oh, as long as I put Tipp-Ex on it, it'll be fine, and I still kept melting pieces, a bit like Rosie was saying, and I was like, what, that's not meant to be allowed. I put the Tipp-Ex on, and it's not like a foolproof method, is it? So yeah.
Also, think about, sorry to interrupt, just think about different ways of positioning your piece on the solder block or as you're soldering it, because you might have it propped up one way and that seems like the right thing because you can see it well, but what if you turn it on its side or at an angle or what have you? That might mean that you can avoid the flame going where you don't want it to go, or you can see it from a different angle. So always think about different ways of positioning things on a solder block as well.
Absolutely. And just similar question someone's asked, which is kind of in the same vein of what we've been talking about. In which case is it the right thing to use Technoflux to avoid unsoldering previous joins? Maybe we can just sort of tag that one on the end.
So I use it mostly for gold, to be honest, and if I'm doing a repair and I don't want a stone to get damaged. So that's when I use it a lot. However, it is good. Let's say, for example, maybe you've made a setting, a claw setting or a collet setting, and you then want to add on another, maybe some granulation or what have you. You can perhaps cover that with your Technoflux. Yeah, that could probably.
Yeah, when you really want to protect a piece, isn't it?
Yeah.
I suppose the times that I've used it is if I've done a lot of work, and I'm like, I'm not okay for this. I will not psychologically be okay if this falls apart right now. I need all the help I can get. And even then, sometimes it does, and you're like, okay, all right, need to make that again. But yeah, I think it's preference, isn't it? I suppose as well. Like I've noticed that some jewelers use it a lot, and it's like a main part of what they use, and for others, it's not. And I guess that's the amazing thing about a lot of the things we're talking about is you can just experiment and try and see, do you like using that? Does it help you with your designs, or is it something that's just not really, kind of gets in the way of the making process? So think with these kind of things, there's no right or wrong, is there, Hayley? It's just kind of learning what different.
Yeah. There's many different ways of doing the same thing. It's funny because there are rules, but there's also rules are made to be broken. So you might find ways that work better for you, and that's fine. I mean, I've taught people who have learned from other people, and then I go, oh my God, why did it never occur to me that that's a way of doing something, where for the last 12 years I've been doing it another way. So there's always different ways of doing the same thing. What gets better is you get better at dealing with when things go wrong. So things will always go wrong, but you'll get better at fixing how they go wrong. And also your nerves will become less stressed by it, and it'll be fine. It's just a piece of jewelry. It's fine.
I'm still waiting for that day, Hayley. I'm ready for it. I'm ready for it. Brilliant. Okay. We have about 10 minutes left and lots of lovely questions. There's a few more. Try and get through them. So Shannon says, I was originally taught to spray my item with, I can't say this, isopropyl alcohol, flux and borax. I think that's a bit redundant. Should I just do the alcohol and the flux? Maybe you can talk about.
Yeah, so this is actually something I've never tried, but I see it a lot in chat forums, and it's really got to do with so alcohol or methyl spirits of various kinds are used. It's very good for things like avoiding fire stain. So but I've never used it, and also you've got to burn it off before you actually solder, because the obvious will happen. It'll become a light. So you want to make sure you know how to use the system properly. Yes, it's basically good for fire stain on silver, but it's also used in other types of soldering. So types of gold soldering, but I think also with platinum soldering it's used as well. So it's more advanced in its technique. To be honest, what we do, we don't need to add any alcohol into it. But if you are doing bigger things and you're worried about fire stain, it might be worth investigating. Just make sure you burn it off first before you bring in your big flame to do the soldering.
Awesome. There we go. Every day's a school day. Learning things. Love it. Sarah says, what's the difference between fire stain and fire scale?
So fire stain is, as we said before, it's the copper content within the silver that's tarnished, and because it's inside the metal, you can't get to it and clean it up. Fire scale is on the outside. It's the crusty stuff on the outside. So it's the charring, basically. So fire scale, you can get rid of. Fire stain, nightmare.
Just avoid it at all costs. Awesome. Chris says, how do you clean the soldering block?
So the soldering block just gets its own character over time. But I did, fun enough, see somebody getting two together on just the other day on social media, and they rubbed the two together and they cleaned each other. So it's a bit like, because it's quite a soft material, it basically I guess it sands itself away. Or maybe just some coarse sandpaper. Try that out. I've not tried it myself, but that might be a way of doing it.
Yeah, I love that neither of us have ever cleaned a solder block before. I think because we're just like, why would we clean it? We just keep going.
Over.
It is a good idea, but also probably have like 28 of them. So I'm just like, oh, just use another one, which isn't normal.
Well, what's good? Yeah, we terrible. You build up different fire blocks and you end up using them as props and propping things up. And if one breaks, keep it, because actually you might find that a shard or a corner is good for holding things in different ways. So don't throw them away. They just become more and more unique in their own way. So yeah,
build character. It's lovely to see it kind of develop. But I have also seen, and never done, someone just get their solder block and just rub it on the pavement. Just go out and just give it a good rub, and then it's all nice and
so, I've seen that.
Yeah. So just rub it on something rough, and then it's all good. Or just leave it and be like me and Hayley. But yeah, you don't want anything, I guess, if you've got like old bits of solder stuck in there or anything like that, that's going to ruin your piece. Then It's probably the right thing to do.
Always, if you can remember, before you do another soldering project, just make sure that there's not bits of solder already on there, because if they then fuse to the bottom of something, that's a bit frustrating.
Yes, absolutely. You don't want to go to all that hard work and then, yeah, and then you've got something unwanted. Um, Someone says, how do you keep your liquid spray flux nozzle from clogging up? I don't know if you use a spray flux nozzle. I do have one, but I don't use it very much. But they're a lot of fun. So you can put liquid flux just into like a, I've got like, you know, those beauty kind of products where you just squirt and it comes out. And if you just want to like spray flux everywhere, I mean, for a lot of pieces, you don't want to do that. You want to be more precise with the brush. I don't know how you keep it from clogging up. I guess you just wash it out with some water.
Soak it in some water.
You might have tried that already and it may not have worked. But yeah, I think we mostly use sort of just the brush, don't we, for a slightly more accurate. Depends what your design is, I suppose. I've seen people use the spray a lot for like big bezels and things where you just got to cover a really big area. But I think it's just a bit of fun, really. Karine says, do you have any recommendations for soldering gold filled? In general, it's going well, but sometimes I have difficulties with tiny jump rings when I'm making a chain. I don't know if you've done any gold filled soldering, Hayley.
I have, and yes, it is tricky because it's got a brass base. I think that's the general construction of it. So brass takes a bit more heat and it also conducts the heat much more quickly. So it has a little bit of a difference in the way solder will flow, but it's the same thing. Just keep the conduction going. And just remember, because brass is a heat conductor, if it's connecting to something else, if there's a solder joint on there already, maybe that's a potential area to watch out for, or maybe the other part is taking some of the heat you need. So it could be something to do with directing the flame again. Also, I wonder if whatever solder you're using, so I presume you're using gold solder, maybe use an easier solder if possible, because it will flow more easily.
Awesome. Yeah, good tips, good ideas. And I think with all these things, it's like trying stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you're never quite sure until you give it a go and you experiment and you think, oh no, that didn't quite work, and I'm going to adjust it. But I think you're right. Gold filled it's difficult. It's difficult to solder well. Really intricate elements.
Yeah. So when you're soldering silver, which we haven't actually mentioned, is you've got to heat up the general area. And silver solder flows because of heat conduction. So you can't just direct the flame at the area, at the solder joint. It will not flow. You've got to heat up the whole area. Gold is the opposite. You heat up the joint almost only, although you can heat up a little bit around it. With gold fill, it's because it's basically a brass base. Brass actually requires the general area to be heat conducted. So maybe that's where there's a bit of confusion as well. Yes.
I think you have to be very quick, because otherwise because it's only a small layer really at the top, it's just gonna kind of sink in.
Right. Yeah.
And I found this with K and Boo as well. Always, anyone doing K and Boo, do your solder joints first. It does work, but it's like it just sinks in, the gold sinks in, and it's just not as strong. So it's one of the dilemmas of gold filled. It's possible, but it's like I think you got to be quick, accurate on it. But good luck. May the solder gods be with you. And like Hayley said, you got to heat up the whole piece, I'm guessing, because of the brass element, but then for the gold element, make sure you heat up the actual joint. So it's challenging. Just a couple more questions. Ian says, how do you solder small silver parts like filigree technique? Well, you're in luck because we have a filigree course. So you should definitely take that, because it is an amazing technique. And Michelle, who teaches it, she makes it so accessible. She's really passionate, Michelle, about filigree. So, I mean, we'll check Hayley's answer as well, but I would definitely recommend taking the course, because she goes into great detail on this, and she'll just make you absolutely love soldering 20 joins in one go, which always seems a bit nuts to begin with. But Hayley, I don't know if you've done anything like.
I've actually never done filigree, but the way I imagine is you've got to construct your whole piece first and then put little bits of solder where you need them. And you've got to lick the flame gently first over the whole thing so the solder doesn't all blow everywhere. And then get the flame to a good temperature and then get your heat going over the whole thing. But you've got, because it's also delicate, you've got to keep that flame moving. So I'm guessing that's how I would do it. Keep the flame moving. And then when you start to see it starting to flow in one area, then you keep it moving around in that area. And then the flame will follow the flow or vice versa. So that's my way of doing it. But I advise watching one of Michelle's videos because she is the masteress of filigree. She's amazing. Yeah.
She really is, and she's constantly learning more, and she's done quite a lot of advanced filigree as well. But you're right, Hayley, it's basically all the solder has to happen at once. So you can't not get some of it. Well, I mean, obviously you can always, but the idea, because it's such tiny thin wire, it's like you said, it all has to be set up and then it all has to go at once. So it's all in the preparation. But it's a lot of fun. And I think it really builds your soldering confidence, like pushing yourself to, whether it's filigree or granulation or whatever, doing kind of tests and little practices to just build your solder confidence is such a useful thing, because if you can solder confidently, that brings so much design freedom in the pieces that you're making. We haven't got to every single question, but we've done nearly all of them. So I'm sorry if we missed any. Feel free to put them in the Jewelers Academy Facebook group, where loads of people will be able to help as well. Thank you so much, Hayley, for coming and sharing some of your wisdom with us tonight. And we have a soldering course with Hayley, and there is 50% off at the moment, and it ends tomorrow. So I'm sure Anna will put the link to that in the chat. It's called the Soldering Masterclass. If you would like to learn to solder from Hayley with an actual video to show you the things and all the projects, then I definitely recommend checking that out. And anyone who is a diploma student will be doing that, I think, this week. It's either this week or next week. So good luck. It's going to be a lot of fun. And Hayley, if people want to come and find you online and say hello and follow you and connect, where is the best place?
Yes, so my website is hayleykruger.com. That's Kruger with a K. And I'm on Instagram as well, Hayley Kruger Jewelry, and on Facebook under Hayley Kruger Jewelry as well.
Awesome. Amazing. Definitely go and give Hayley a follow if you're not already. She is a wonderful jeweler and a lovely person to learn from. And yeah, we look forward to seeing some of you on her course. And I look forward to seeing some of you guys on a future bench tips as well. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll speak soon. Bye, Hayley. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.